Greetings! I'm Zachary Hepner. I'm pleased to share this Torah with you for Parashat Vzot HaBracha and Simchat Torah. First Folio, published in 1623, 7 years following Shakespeare's death, was originally published under the title of Mr. William Shakespeare's Comedies and Histories and Tragedies, published according to the true original copies. First Folio is a collection of 36 works of Shakespeare. Allegedly, this preserved over half of Shakespeare's works that otherwise would have been lost to us today, as they had not been previously published in quarto form. Quarto form is a book or pamphlet made up of one or more full sheets of paper on which 8 texts were printed. Like every blatt gemara, which begins on page 2, or DAF BEIS, the First Folio has the engraved portrait of William Shakespeare as we have him today. Also, like most blatt gemaras, page 1 is often overlooked, as is the case with page 1 of the First Folio. Let's read page 1. That's commentary of the engraving on page 2. To the reader, this figure that thou here sees put, it was for gentle Shakespeare cut, wherein the graver had a strife with nature to outdo the life. Oh, could he but have drawn his wit as well in phrase as he had his face, the print would then surpass all that was ever in phrase. But since he cannot, reader, look not on his picture, but his book. The message being, don't pay attention to this portrait, because no picture can surely capture Shakespeare's wit, or in today's terms, his sharp mind, but read the books. In the final chapter of Devarim, chapter 34, the Torah relates that God tells Moses to climb Mount Nebo, where he will see the Holy Land, and then Moses will die. God buries Moses in the land of Moab, and nobody knows exactly where Moses is buried. Moses dies at 120 years. His sight had not dimmed, and his moisture did not shrivel. The text's interest in Moses' features is peculiar. We ought not be interested in Moses' physical features as long as his mind was fully intact, and that he faithfully disseminated God's word. In fact, it says a few verses later, "V'lo kam navi od b'Yisrael k'Moshe, asher yada'o Hashem panim el panim." Never again did there arise in Israel a prophet like Moshe who knew God face to face. So the question is, why the physical details? I'm going to add another question, and that is, why do many commentators, such as Chizkuni being one of them, on verse 7, say that not only is this a physical description of Moshe in his lifetime, but even after Moshe had died? Let's go on a tangent and discuss an article written by Professor Schneur S.Z. Lyman in Tradition, fall 1991, where he discusses an episode where the 19th century Rabbi Yisrael Lipschitz, in his Parashat Mishnah of Tiferet Yisrael, on Kiddushin, chapter 4, quoted an obscure midrash about the portrait of Moshe, how Rabbi Lipschitz incurred the wrath of censorship from his colleagues. Let's discuss and read this midrash. An Arabian monarch, upon hearing about the fame and adulation that were being heaped upon Israel's great liberator, dispatched a skilled artist to paint a portrait of Moses. The portrait was subsequently shown to a team of wise physiognomists, practitioners of the ancient science of analyzing personalities based on their facial characteristics. The experts all concurred that this was the face of an intrinsically depraved personality, who is tainted with the moral vices of arrogance, avarice, and stubbornness. The king was baffled at how this contradicted Moses' glorious reputation, and yet the artists and the physiognomists all protested that they had performed their tasks competently. This left the astonished king with no alternative but to pay a personal visit to Moses in the desert. After confirming that the portrait had indeed been a precise likeness, he told the Hebrew prophet of his puzzling dilemma. To the king's surprise, Moses confirmed the findings of the physiognomists. He explained that he really was naturally predisposed to all the evils that had been diagnosed by these royal experts. And even more so, it was only by means of a supreme effort of will that Israel's liberator had eventually succeeded in overpowering his wicked inclinations and transforming himself into the celebrated model of righteousness. In fact, Moses argued, there is nothing particularly praiseworthy in merely being gifted with inborn virtue and immunity to sin, without having to undergo arduous moral struggles. Contemporaries of Rabbi Lipschitz went for his jugular. Firstly, they had never heard of this medrash. Secondly, it's a backhanded compliment or a slight on the allegedly pure natural inclinations of Moses. Rabbi Eliyahu Rabinowitz Ta'omim and Rav Moshe Yoshua Leib Diskin claimed that Rabbi Lipschitz had borrowed the story from pagan literature, or possibly a German children's storybook. Professor Lyman has demonstrated that in fact Rabbi Lipschitz probably got the story from an earlier Jewish source, though the origins of the story are probably indeed from Gentile stock. And the earliest version of the story could be found in Cicero about Socrates, so it likely dates over 2,000 years ago and is from Roman or Greek origins. But regardless of what one thinks, the Torah considered it important to provide some physical features of Moses. So, after these antics about Shakespeare and his portrait and the medrash of what Moses looked like in the Rabbi Lipschitz medrash, let's discuss a different version and a different pshat which can provide perspective. The Torah describes Moses' eyes and the moist nature of his appearance. The eyes emphasize what God says in Hereticha ve'enecha v'shama lo ta'avor. You will see the land but not cross over. What an incredible blessing. God sentences Moses to not going into the Holy Land, but he will see the land. God says he'll see it, and consequently Moses was endowed with mature eyesight. That's the eyesight. But what about the moisture? The moisture is a literary inclusion in the Torah, beginning in the end of Genesis and ending in the end of the book of Joshua. Jacob dies. Joseph falls on him and kisses his father. Subsequently, Jacob is embalmed, mourned, and buried in Marat HaMachpelah. Joseph dies. He adjures his brothers to bury him in the promised land. After he dies, he too is embalmed. The embalming narrative of Jacob and Joseph is only closed in the penultimate verse at the end of the book of Joshua, Joshua 24, when Joseph is buried in Shechem, his tribal plot. Moses' part was integral in this bringing of Joseph's bones out of Egypt, as it says, Vaikach Moshe tatzmot Yosef imo. Moses took Joseph's bones with him. Listen carefully now to the end of the penultimate verse in the book of Joshua. V'tatzmot Yosef asher halu b'nei Yisrael Mitzrayim kavru v'Shechem b'chalkat asher asher kana Yaakov me'pnei Chamor v'Shechem b'me'ak ksita v'ayu livnei Yosef lenachala. The bones of Joseph were buried in the Joseph's land, and that land had become the title to the tribes of Joseph. Jacob died, was embalmed and buried by his children in his ancestral plot. Joseph died and was embalmed, and after hundreds of years, he too was buried by his descendants in Shechem in his family plot. But Moses, being from the tribe of Levi, doesn't get any family plot nor any land. God takes Moses' life, but unlike the Egyptian embalmers, who desiccate the body's moisture, God can and do better than these Egyptian engineers. Embalmers preserve the body with desiccants, but God embalms with divine moisture. Moses is preserved as the quintessential servant of the Almighty. We've discussed many topics. The First Folio, the peculiar description of Moses' portrait, and the story and what happened to Rabbi Yisrael Lipschitz afterwards. The relevance of Moses having good vision was to see the promised land. Moses dying with a moist body links him to the embalming of Jacob and Joseph, and to the irony that Moses will get no land in contrast to Jacob and Joseph. The Torah concludes that Moses had seen God face to face, a direct reference to the Miriam leprosy narrative, that Moses is unlike Miriam because Moses is a prophet that sees God face to face. The Torah adds one other description, Ha'ish Moshe anav me'od mikol adam. Moses was the most humble person more than anyone else. My father, my Avi Mori, points out that anav resonates with ayin, eyes, which may or may not have been a support for the Chizkuni when the Chizkuni said that Moses' eyes would have been preserved even after his death. But the pshat is that it means the most humble. And there you have it. The most humble person who served his entire life for others, even the thankless job of returning Joseph to Joseph's ancestral lot, despite Moses having no ancestral land nor any entrance into the Holy Land. It is this Moses that God is the sole taker of his life, God is his chevra kadisha, and God is Moses' personal embalmer. At this point, Moses returns to his loving Father in heaven. Wishing you a Shabbat Shalom, and a good Yontif, and a happy Simchat Torah, and a good Kvittel. Chazak, chazak, v'nit chazek.